Okay, well, hello. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar on maximising the efficiency of your stock, all about right-sizing and vacancy chains. My name is Kate Roberts. I'm a principal consultant here at Altair, and I'll be chairing today's session. We've got three fantastic speakers joining us today who I'll introduce in a moment. Firstly, I just wanted to give a bit of an overview of how today will run. Each speaker will have around 12 minutes to walk you through their work, and then they'll answer any questions you have at the end of the presentations. Please use the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and I believe you're able to upvote other people's questions, but I might be wrong with that. I've got that many different webinar sessions, I'm not sure which one's which, but by all means, please feed through the questions throughout the sessions. We are recording today's session, so we'll aim to share that with you as soon as possible after we've finished, and feel free to contact us if you do have any other further questions as well. So on to today's topic. We know that the big political push at the moment in housing is all about build, but the pace at which the sector is able to build is not enough to tackle some of the issues that we're already facing. With waiting lists continuing to stagnate, overcrowding and under-occupation exacerbating issues such as physical and mental health of tenants, as well as creating challenges around damp, mould and condensation, we know that we can find solutions through effective management of our existing stock. Today's speakers will walk you through the fantastic work that they've been doing to help with this, and there'll also be a call to arms to engage with us at Altair as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. Firstly, you'll be hearing from Leo Pollak. He's a wide-ranging housing practitioner, having worked in a number of senior strategy delivery and research roles across as a council officer and a cabinet member, consultant and researcher. He served as a cabinet member for housing in London Borough of Southwark from 2018 to 21. And oversaw the largest expansion of council housing building in the UK. Leo's going to be talking through maximising social housing supply through allocations and lettings, and also highlighting some of the amazing work from the report that was published through the Smith Institute earlier this year. Morley will be joining us from Altair. He's a consultant at Altair with an academic background in politics and international relations. Since 2019, when Will joined Altair, he's undertaken research for a range of housing associations, local authorities and representative housing bodies. His work includes a review of the private rented sector across neighbouring local authority areas, reviewing the regulatory standards on behalf of the Irish Council for Social Housing, and most recently the review of the Scottish regulatory framework on behalf of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. And Will's going to talk through a research project that he was involved in earlier this year on behalf of Altair in Rightsizing in the Isle of Wight. And then we'll be over to Ninesh, who will be talking through increasing social housing allocation through tenant choice and vacancy chains. Ninesh is a serial innovator in social housing software applications and founder of Home Connections. Ninesh established and has led Home Connections for over 15 years, possessing in-depth knowledge of social housing issues, information technology, social services and social enterprise on a European level. His expertise has helped to shape Home Connections as a European award-winning customer-focused service with an emphasis on access for vulnerable home seekers. And I'm so glad that's my bit done. So I'm now going to hand over to Leo to basically tell us about what he's been doing. Leo, I take it you do want me to share your slides because I know your connection's a little bit tricky today. So
I'll try and do it myself to start.
Okay.
And if I disappear, then the backup will come to the rescue.
Great, thank you.
Grand. So yeah, thank you so much, Kate and Jodie, everyone at Altair and Home Connections for setting up the session. It's great to see lots of people here and engaging with these really important issues, given the scale of the housing crisis that is sort of raging outside as we speak. Can you see that slide up? Is it visible? If someone, yes, I'm seeing a nodding Thank you, Jodie. I only see your face. So you will be my cue to the outside world. Thank you. Yeah, I'll try to be as quick as I can because I'm conscious we've got lots to get through with Will and Ninesh as well. I want to sort of talk about an approach to expanding social housing provision using existing stock. That was something that troubled me as a cabinet member and general housing researcher, policy person, and kind of activist. Just the extent to which lettings had been moving in the wrong direction, all the while as London boroughs and housing associations were kind of picking up their social housing, house building programs over the last few years, albeit from historically a very low base. So I'm here with two hats on. Firstly, as a deputy cabinet member for housing allocations from the London Borough of Southwark, where I moonlight as a councillor, and also as a research fellow with the Smith Institute, where I did a slightly deeper dive into the issues around occupancy, rightsizing, and chain making, looking at London boroughs in particular. So to start with a kind of miserable kind of reality check, the housing crisis seems to be getting more and more extreme as we go on. I was speaking to some people earlier today who worked in the sector for 40 years, and they've never known it to be any worse than it is now in terms of the numbers trying to join waiting lists, the numbers of evictions, the numbers of homeless presentations, people in TA, the lack of supply in private renting, and so on. So I'd sort of thought it would be an idea to present a mix of some of my London-wide and England-wide research, and also what we're doing in Southwark to try and use the chain-making framework to provide an additional boost to housing supply. So our context is dire. We're getting 600, sometimes up to 800 new applications to join our waiting list each month, which is almost double what it was just before the pandemic. I thought it was pretty bad back then. Homeless presentations are skyrocketing. We all know about the issues with PRS in London in particular, but across the board, and just the unaffordability of private renting and house prices, and the fact that the LHA rate has been frozen now for over 2-3 years, I think. The other bit of context that's kind of crucial here is just the demographic changes we're seeing. So the number of residents over 65 due to increase by over 35% in Southwark, but in many different places. And there are different expectations around how people will live when they're older. So I don't think I need to dwell on this too much. And I think there's a bit in some of the later presentations, but we know how the effects of overcrowding, the different kinds of housing need that appear on our housing waiting lists kind of impinge on those who are experiencing huge issues in relation to people's health, their relationships, their economic well-being, their prospects, their sense of self-esteem and identity even. And these are issues that really kind of rumble into later life. And we seem to be storing up enormous problems for future generations, given the shortfall of social housing at present. And similar kind of patterns with homelessness and those living in TA, often with so many boroughs just unable to find TA placements in the neighbourhoods that they oversee. Lots of out of borough placements, huge disruption for families, for people growing up with the uncertainty around their housing, and the whole range of medical, welfare, disability issues that we could talk about at great length, on top of asylum seekers, refugees, and the cost of living crisis making access to affordable, secure, good quality housing ever more difficult. And then on top of that, we have all the issues relating to people trying to prepare for old age. I know this couple because they live in my ward, and this is this brand new almshouse, which I encourage you all to come and visit once they're taking visitors. Just completed over the last couple of months in Southwark Park Road in Bermondsey. But a lot of issues around changing preferences that people have for later living, and obviously with that on theme, issues around right sizing, under occupancy and the solution for many families who are overcrowded. A quick kind of rattle through of where we are in Southwark. The needs are huge. We've got 17,500 on our waiting list. As you would expect, very big numbers overcrowded, very big numbers who are homeless. That large number, no assessed need. These are just those who don't meet the often stringent criteria of reasonable preference categories, but these are people who we don't want to leave behind in any case. So big need and growing all the time. And the spread of lettings, as you would imagine, is sort of dominated by placements out of homelessness or from TA, overcrowded families, medical welfare issues, and so on. And despite, you know, our best efforts, 59 under occupiers, every one of those had a lot of effort that went into it. So I'm really interested to hear Will's presentation to see what research and kind of tricks they've uncovered in the Isle of Wight. But the overall picture really is not a good one, despite the fact that Southwark has the biggest council house building programme in the country. You know, the extent to which new social housing translates into lettings is really pressured, and this is the pattern that we've seen over the past decade. The churn, that is lettings as a proportion of overall housing stock, has more than halved within a decade in almost every London borough. This is the picture that I picked up across London, and you'll see that there's huge falls pretty much almost everywhere, really, but particularly in those boroughs that either that for a range of sort of social demographic reasons have quite low churn. However, in spite of all this, we're building lots of new council homes, and we're starting to see that translate, certainly in 22, 23. We have over 1,000 that are due to come online over the next year. So a lot of preparatory work to make sure that we've got the kind of infrastructure in place to ensure people really do move in and we get the best rehousing impact from those new homes. So it's bleak, but also exciting all at once. And generally, I think much of this will be quite obvious. Why do people want to stay in social housing? Because it's secure, affordable, and in most instances of decent quality. Though there are obviously big challenges with the quality of social housing that many social landlords are facing. The huge growing gap between the cost of social and private housing costs, the general undersupply of family-sized homes and really good quality, attractive older people's housing, and a bit of a kind of planning lag that I see everywhere, really, in terms of the evidence of where demographic trends and preferences are going, and once homes actually do get built, often many, many years apart. And of course, all the effects of austerity over the past decade. And then in terms of actual letting systems, we can talk about void turnaround, the software packages for which Ninesh will put forward his brilliant ideas to resolve, and then also just lots of what I think are just often common sense not being followed in terms of criteria allowing for people to move either as under occupiers or through mutual exchange. It might just be somebody who is under occupying by many bedrooms, wants to move, and there's a few pounds in rent arrears, so has a kind of low banding or low points. I see that all the time. So what we're trying to do, on top of getting on top of empty homes, securing social housing through the planning system, expanding our own in-house council house building programme as far as the finances will allow, but no further. How can we try to use existing stock to expand social housing supply in a choice-based kind of context? And this is all about really bringing forward the chain maximising, chain making approach, where we're not just assessing the housing demand and the different types of needs that are characterised on our waiting list, but also what kind of supply can be released as well. And with that, we have these chain maximising protocols that are all about dredging up lots of data on the preferences and needs of people on our waiting list within given neighbourhoods, but also the type of home that would be released. And from that basis, trying to simulate different chain outcomes, as well as crucially always making sure that you are at once creating the longest chain, but also terminating the chain with the highest priority needs. So you strike that balance as best as possible. And we're trying to do this now in Southwark in a number of different ways. I won't dwell on this too much. I think it kind of hopefully goes without saying that we just simply have a huge mismatch of supply and demand for social housing. And there are lots of benefits, particularly in terms of managing large waiting lists, getting people out of TA, and also potential increases in rent revenue from relets that can come about by taking this chain lettings approach. So just to quickly describe what this looks like. So this is a no chain scenario, which is depressingly common. So we've got 3 new build social homes on the left there, 8 homeless households or households in TA in the middle, and that's people in existing stock. The green are happily housed, the pink need to be rehoused. And the no chain scenario goes like that. I say homeless, it could be a number of different chain terminating types of use, which we'll get into. But generally that has been quite a common pattern, particularly as councils are trying to get on top of their TA costs and the scale of homelessness in their area. The chain making approach is transfer driven. So we've got three transfer moves into the new build, 2 more transfer moves and a homeless placement, another transfer move and a homeless placement, a transfer, and then a homeless placement at the end of all 3 chains. And I think the key thing to compare about these no chain and chain making scenarios is that one rehouses 3 households and another rehouses 10. And crucially, in both instances, you haven't discriminated against homeless households. You've achieved 3 lets in both scenarios. And generally the way that I've kind of broken down the different categories of chain continuing and chain terminating lets is by characterizing sometimes the base list, depending how the people on waiting lists are kind of categorized. But generally chain terminating uses will be from homelessness, households within households, so often severely overcrowded households who you'd want to give high priority to, including and especially out of the private rented sector, and also when you've got people being moved out of homes if there's redevelopment or invasive building safety works taking place. And then chain continuing is transfers, and you always maximize your chain potential by prioritizing in order of under occupiers, like for like moves, 1-bed upsizes, and so on. But of course, always striking that balance to ensure that you've got the highest priority needs catered for in each chain. This is Southwark over the past year. So 2/3 of our lets overall were chain terminating. The data I found across London and England, actually, that's relatively low. I've seen over 90% chain terminating. So often just a big trick being missed in terms of the supply that there is to be had being brought forward to get people off the waiting list and into the right kind of housing that they need. There are different ways of looking at this as well. The waiting list tells you one story, the census tells quite another, and we've got particularly stark figures for overcrowding and under occupation just within social housing, council and housing association within Southwark. I should always add, Southwark is unusual in having a very large proportion of its housing is social housing, by far the largest council landlord in the country, but proportionally against population and the spread of by tenure, this kind of corresponds to what I see in many other boroughs. So really, really big numbers that tell quite a profound story, really, about the extent to which the housing system in London is working. And I've broken it down by ward just to get individual ward councillors exercised by it, which seems to do the trick, I think. So let's look at a real world example. This is Wellsford Street, which is a new council home scheme that was completed a couple of years ago. It was slightly unusual in that they were all, these are 10 homes, all family size homes, including 6 4-beds. Sadiq likes to use this in his various promotional literature because they're quite nice looking. He said he actually wanted to move into one of these, but I had to break the news to him that he wouldn't qualify. What we did for this project was because there was a long back and forth about what type of scheme could be catered for on this particular site. It was a garage site next to some kind of conservation area terraces. We decided eventually to kind of cut to the chase and build some beautiful terraced housing with gardens on the edge of Zone 1, and then go really big on trying to create chains once they were built so we could get the same kind of rehousing impact that we would if we built a block of flats. While we didn't quite follow through for a number of reasons I won't dwell on here with the full chain maximising approach, we did do many of the really important steps, crucially bring out a lot of really rich data, of which there's a little summary here around people's occupancy, their need, the kinds of homes that would be released from to support a local letting scheme that we developed for the neighbouring streets and blocks. And with that data, we were able to simulate different chain outcomes. Here's the one that the finance director liked, which was get people off out of my TA households off my general fund. 10 homes, 10 households rehoused, which is a good outcome for them, but big opportunity cost. Because we're dealing with lots of family-sized homes, there was an opportunity to go as big as this, which is rather than 10, 48 households rehoused by applying as far as was possible one-bed upsizing. These are all based on real households. I think by round 5, we would have rehoused all of the households who were identified in priority need in that local lettings area. And you can see there's a good spread of different types of need catered for. And in the end,
can you just wrap up, please?
Sure. And in the end, we kind of got somewhere in between, which was kind of an okay outcome. So I won't dwell on this too much because I know Will's got more to say about this, but there's lots about looking to enhance the offer for under occupiers, lots in terms of what the appropriate incentive level would be, the support and navigation, the relationship, the kind of patient approach that's required, and lots to say as well about the importance of establishing a business case, the savings of the TA bill, the increased revenues from relets, and crucially, the cost of having households in housing need rehoused compared to new build. It's very favourable, as you'd imagine. Lots of opportunities upcoming to pilot chain lettings, both on a local letting scheme, but also on an estate basis, kind of better fit defrag type approach, which we'll be taking forward at the Kingswood estate in South Dulwich. Lots of work we're doing at the minute, trying to pathfind what that process might be, doing a lot of void management with residents who are in situ in occupied homes. So all of this coming up, but we're really in kind of listening and learning mode and keen to hear people's thoughts and stories from across the country so that we can have the best chance of success over the next few months. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Leo. I really didn't want to cut you off because it's just so fascinating, the stuff that you're doing. I love it. But hopefully we will be able to pick some of that up with the questions that are coming through as well. So please keep the questions coming. We will ask them at the end once everyone's had their presentation. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to Will Morley now.
Brilliant. Great. Can you see those okay?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So I'm going to be doing a short presentation to you today on some research that was carried out by myself and my colleague Becca for the Isle of Wight Council on their right-sizing policy. You'll notice a very deliberate play on words at the top there. That is not a spelling mistake. That was our nickname for the project that I thought would be worth including here on the opening slide. Just in case there's anyone on the webinar that might not be familiar with the terminology of right sizing, unlike downsizing, which focuses more on an underoccupied home household moving into a smaller property, Rightsizing focuses more on meeting the needs and preferences of a household when moving to a new home to create a more active and positive choice for their move. So before I dive into the research, I think it would be helpful to cover some of the kind of wider national picture for overcrowding and under-occupancy in England. So according to the latest English Housing Survey, around 730,000 households live in overcrowded conditions in England, over half of which are in social housing. On the other hand, it is estimated that in 2021 to 22, around 10% of all social homes were under-occupied by 2 or more spare bedrooms, which equates to just over 400,000 homes, as you can see on the screen there. And there are detrimental impacts of both overcrowding and under-occupation in social housing. Research from the NHF into the impact of overcrowding, published earlier this year, highlighted that over 2/3 of overcrowded families say they've experienced both poor mental and physical health as a direct result of overcrowding. Issues related to disrepair and damp and mould are well documented about overcrowded conditions in England, as well as there being social challenges for those living in overcrowded properties too. On the other hand, as well, under-occupied households also have a detrimental impact on those living there, such as high energy and utility costs, the bedroom tax, council tax. But there are also wider issues such as damp and mould in under-occupied properties if the tenant is unable to effectively heat and ventilate their home. And we believe there's been a renewed interest in addressing occupancy issues in the sector, in part due to the effects of damp and mould in overcrowded properties, but also in part due to the constraints on development and providers seeking alternative solutions to make best use of their current stock. So moving on then to the research itself. So Altair were commissioned by the Isle of Wight Council to support them in designing a new right-sizing policy. In order to do so, we undertook research to firstly understand the level of under-occupancy on the island. Secondly, to understand the key moving considerations for residents on the island, including what might prevent them from moving or what they might want from a new home. And then finally, we were looking to understand what registered providers and other stakeholders thought was important for any right-sizing policy going forward, including any challenges and barriers for their organisation. We carried out a comprehensive suite of research methods to understand what the best practice for right-sizing policies was in the sector currently and how the policy could be best tailored for the Isle of Wight Council. So a quick bit of background on the Isle of Wight itself and its housing market. So housing need has been exacerbated on the island due to a number of factors. Firstly, average house prices have more than doubled in the last 10 years, which is a higher rate of increase than London. And this, combined with factors associated with the pandemic, has led to an 82% reduction in private rented sector accommodation being available. And as such, this has had a knock-on effect for the island social housing waiting list, which increased by 5% just in the last year. You'll see in the top left that there are a similar amount of households both under-occupying and overcrowding in social housing on the island. And therefore, the council identified right-sizing as a solution to firstly help relieve the pressure on the housing waiting list, but also make best use of their current stock through effective vacancy chains. So as part of our desktop review for the research, we looked to identify both the drivers and the barriers for households to right-size in order to support formulating the Isle of Wight's policies. We categorised the drivers into 5 main categories. So firstly, some of the financial drivers for households to right-size, including having cheaper bills in a downsized property and removing the bedroom tax. Some of the personal and emotional factors that drove households to right-size included a change in a household's personal circumstances, meaning they would need to move to a property that would reflect those new circumstances, and just also feeling more safe and secure in a new property. Some of the practical drivers included being unable to manage their current home, whether it be size of the home or the garden, etc. We found that some of the social and community drivers included increasing social possibilities by moving and the ability to maintain or increase proximity to family and social networks. And then finally, some of the other drivers included retaining space or bedrooms and the potential for having care services from a new move. As part of our research, we also explored what the drivers were for people who had downsized and who were looking to downsize in the Isle of Wight through a survey and interviews with residents on the island. And similarly to the drivers that we found from our wider literature review, it was clear that the drivers for residents on the island were not a homogenous group. What was important to some was not important to others, and there was a really wide variety of criteria that included drivers such as property size, being closer to family and friends, closer to schools, closer to employment, having a better rent level, and the type of tenancy agreement being more secure. So it really was a lot of diverse drivers, and we wanted to have a approach to our right sizing policy for the island to reflect that. Looking into some of the barriers that we identified from our literature review, and you'll see that we've fitted these into the 5 categories of the drivers because they actually mirrored the drivers for those households to right size. So firstly, some of the financial barriers for households the right size included just the high cost of moving, as well as the complex financial considerations and decisions that would need to be made to move home. This was particularly prevalent for older people. Some of the personal barriers included strength of emotional ties to their existing homes, and just moving feeling daunting and stressful. Some of the practical barriers included reluctance to give up extra space, as well as concerns about the practicalities of switching landlords, either from local authority to a housing association and vice versa. Some of the social and community barriers for households to right size included not wanting to move away from family, friends, and social networks, as well as moving away from not wanting to move away, from local services. And then finally, some of the other barriers for households to right side included there being a mismatch of available properties to their preferences, as well as accommodation to meet their medical and care needs not being available. The next part of our research then looked at how registered providers were addressing the barriers currently. So as part of our research, we reviewed policies from 6 local authorities and registered providers, as well as holding a roundtable with local authorities and social landlords to explore their approaches to right sizing and downsizing. And as you can see here, the approaches all look to address the barriers we identified in the previous part of our review. So firstly, the policy approaches aimed at addressing the financial barriers. These included financial incentives. So this would typically be X amount was given to the household per bedroom released. We saw these range from as small as £1,000 incentives up to the highest we saw, which was £32,700. Now this was a bit of an outlier, and it consisted of £5,000 per room being released. And there was then a 20% premium for 4+ bedrooms, an additional 10% premium for of 10% for adapted properties, and then finally a £200 welfare premium for tenants moving to sheltered accommodation. But interestingly, we found from our roundtable that financial incentives only work to a certain degree. We had one participant who worked for a local authority who has incentives of around £10,000 per bedroom, but they said this was scaled back as it did not bring any additional moves compared to what they got when they're offering a lower amount, and they felt it actually really hinged on finding the right property point for the households. Some of the other financial policy initiatives included covering the cost of repairs, clearing rent arrears for residents, and providing a moving allowance for households. You'll see here that we were unable to identify any policy approaches that look to address the personal or emotional barriers, but it was felt that collectively that they were collective package would look to address this. Some of the policy approaches aimed at addressing some of the practical barriers included a dedicated right-sizing officer, arranging removal, transfer, handyman and declutter services, as well as helping with measurements for carpets and curtains. Keeping spared bedroom was one of the policy approaches we saw in aiding some of the social and community barriers for residents to downsize. And then finally, some of the other initiatives we saw tended to be fringed around providing more advice and information on the options available and in finding a new home for the residents. But we found that there was no silver bullet for the measures. There were, providers providing a range of initiatives such as right-sizing offers and long-term tenancies. We also saw one provider who is looking to implement AI to match under and over occupiers in their council, and I'm sure Ninesh will also touch on some of the chain letting approaches that Home Connections are undertaken as well. So as such, we therefore recommended a framework of measures that look to kind of cover a range of areas, but recognize that one offer alone would not hit the mark. So for example, our first recommendation of a financial incentive, although we heard that really high ones maybe weren't as effective, it was still recognized that having a financial incentive was effective as part of a wider package. So we recommended that based on the property size, a maximum of £4,000 was offered. We also recommended that support service was included alongside a financial payment as part of an incentive package for residents on the Isle of Wight. We also recommended to the council that they set an annual target for right-sizing under-occupied households based on their existing data on the amount of moves on the island. We also suggested that the council employ a dedicated right-sizing officer on a full-time basis. So their role would be to support tenants in moving, reviewing occupancy data, potentially organising multiple spots, creating a vacancy chain for properties on the island. We then suggested that the council work with partners to increase the amount of information and advice available to residents on right-sizing on the island. We also suggested that rent arrears and eligibility criteria was reviewed. So for households in rent arrears, right-sizing would be allowed if rent arrears had been accrued related to the bedroom tax or costs associated with running a larger home, and that any financial incentives should be used to pay off rent arrears. And then finally, we also recommended that the council should pay for standard adaptations with disability facilities grant if they're not part of the letting standard, and that occupational therapy should make assessments for larger adaptations paid for by DFG once the tenant has moved. So that kind of rounds off the research we undertook, but just got a final slide here on a bit of a call to arms on another piece of research that we're undertaking on behalf of a local authority in the southeast of England. So similarly, we're reviewing their downsizing policy, but we're also looking to undertake a survey of registered providers' approaches to downsizing to try and understand a bit more on what best practices, taking a look at the kind of range of financial incentives, target setting, and what the challenges and benefits were to the organisation. And we're going to hold a roundtable session with registered providers at the end of the project to share our findings from the survey as well as from the review itself. So this is a bit of a call to arms that if you would be interested in getting involved, we would be really appreciative, but also I think there would be some helpful learning at the roundtable later on. Do get in touch with us, either just pop a message into the chat right now or email either myself, Kate, or at ds@altairltd.co.uk. But apart from that, that's me. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for keeping it on track. I appreciate that. I'm going to fly through now because we are really short on time. Please, like I say, keep the questions coming. I can see them coming through, and we will try and find time for as many of them as possible. I'd like to introduce now Ninesh Muthiah, who's going to talk through some of the brilliant work that can kind of tie in nicely to this. Ninesh, are you there? I see no face.
Oh, I am here. I think I
Okay.
must have accidentally covered up my screen. I was just going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it okay.
Yeah, we could see the presentation version, the presenter version. There it is, perfect.
All right, thanks. Yeah, Kate, I will try and go a bit faster than planned to make up for time. Thanks for inviting me. So home connections and vacancy change through CBL. So this is a bit more of a practical discussion on how we could implement it with sort of existing allocations technology. Just a little bit about us, first of all. We're a social purpose company. We deliver IT, but our mission really is to help people obtain their housing solutions and requirements, and we're a non-profit company as well. So this slide here is courtesy of Tower Hamlets, and it kind of illustrates both the complexity and benefits of the chain approach, where you have in the middle the vacancy created, whether it be a new build or a vacant void that's come up, and the potential beneficiaries in terms of the different people and how that chain works through. I won't read through each component, but that kind of gives you an idea of both the benefits and the difficulties of matching these types of applicants together to achieve this type of chain letting. So, as the two speakers have outlined, chain lettings has become much more topical, partly because of the whole supply-demand crisis, and a number of pilots are being considered within the sector, and we have been heavily involved in discussing with our customers. First of all, a little bit about the challenges of chains, because if it's so good, why isn't more of it taking place or happening at the moment? And truth be told, this isn't a new idea. This has been around for quite a while, but there are multiple challenges in enabling this chain-based lettings approach. So firstly, there's a requirement for specialist officers, as Will explained in his Isle of Wight case study. Without the specialist officers, you're not going to have this working, really. You're not going to be able to do the matches. So therefore, it's implied an overly manual approach. And then given that it's overly manual approach, what are the success rates? So chains can take a long time to set up, lots of discussions, lots of negotiation, but chains can very easily break down. And if you're trying to construct a huge long chain, then actually a break at the weakest link could potentially mean that the whole chain breaks down. So all of that effort that you put into it goes to nothing. And as I've said, finding matches can be difficult as well. And, you know, there is this strong focus on both under-occupation and overcrowding, as there should be, which itself makes the task more complex, because you're dealing with more vulnerable, perhaps older, and therefore more difficult engagement, taking longer times to achieve a result. So the outcome of all of this could actually be an increase in void turnaround times and potentially an increase in cost from void work. So these are some of the reasons, some of the challenges that need to be overcome to get these types of vacancy chains happening. And we believe, working alongside, you know, Altair and people like Leo, actually these challenges can be overcome. So for instance, rather than building one long massive chain, actually if we just focused on coupling the pairs and getting those links moving and happening, we can get better movement, and those pairs, those couples can be joined together. So we actually do create a chain, but we don't have this long process of constructing a long chain, which is a greater risk of breaking down. So that's kind of one way we can do this. We could also, you know, de-link this very strong connection to under-occupation and overcrowding. So I'm not saying we abandon that, but actually the key to this is tenant-to-tenant mobilities, the transfers, until we get to the point where we allow, you know, other types of applicants and customers in, like homeless, private sector, etc., to make sure they're not excluded. But by compromising and allowing tenant-to-tenant transfers to happen, that's a way we can keep the chains moving and avoid the breakdowns and delays where we're waiting quite a long time for quite a complex case to join in that chain. I think automation of the process is really important. So within our choice-based letting systems, we've got a lot of flexibility to configure and to really allow a combination of both an automated and a manual intervention. So the software can suggest the potential matches, can find the potential matches, which then triggers the officers to engage in the discussion. And then perhaps there could be a degree of override that if other customers come in. So I think this automation would help in reducing the cost and the manual intervention of running lists and complex lists. And I think the feedback is really important. So clear reporting on how these chains are developing. And the reporting would also reinforce the effectiveness and success of the chain, so that would inspire greater confidence in doing more of this and allow the transparency to happen. So a pilot or a prototype is really the way forward. It's not something that we need to do right across the allocations policy, but we can prove its worth through a minimum viable product and then use that to develop it further with any local authority. As I mentioned, we've got a very powerful configurable CBL engine, which allows us to do this through bidding, match lists in the back office, and combining the chain-based approach with the software to minimize and help the officers who are still needed to do this type of work. And as I've said, we can. It doesn't mean we don't still prioritize the under-occupiers and the overcrowded groups as well. In terms of some of the changes that might be needed to software systems, CBL systems, some of the following information might be needed for applicants. So applicant types, to identify those who are chain maximizing and chain terminating, as Leo outlined. Some of the areas, the preferred area, number of bedrooms given up, the priority reasons in relation to under occupation, coding of these. All of these are sort of important changes that will be needed to make and can be made to our system, for instance. And likewise, in relation to properties, certain changes would be required to enable this type of chain making and property to applicant matching. I won't go through reading all of this, but it just kind of gives you a flavor of what we'd need to do. And again, in terms of automating the bid lists, these are some of the changes that we can and would need to do. So finally, getting towards the end now, Kate, you'll be pleased to hear. So reporting and monitoring, I think this is really important, that we can visualize the chains as they begin to develop, so the staff can see what's happening, and you get that real-time view, and that will obviously be beneficial for councillors and members as well. This, as I said, shows where we are succeeding and where we are failing, and what the causes of failure are, and which chains are longer than others, and what's underlying that, and also to monitor the length of time taken compared to non-chain allocations activity, so that we could again make sure that we focus on minimizing the length of the chains and avoiding a negative impact on void turnarounds. Finally, I think, so tenant engagement is actually really important to this process. So if you imagine this a little bit like the mutual exchange process, where the tenants are involved and encouraged to get their properties ready, to promote their properties because they are actually interested in the swap. I was talking to Mark Meehan the other day, and I think Mark's on the call. Perhaps you can come in on this, Mark. How important this is, and the discussions between the groups coming in and the tenants vacating, and how they can be incentivized to get their properties ready and in good condition. And that's, to some extent, can mitigate some of the extra costs around voids that can occur because of the extra numbers, because of the increased churn. And then there's also the landlord's responsibility in terms of what they need to do to get the properties ready in time for the viewings and for the match and the move. So yeah, hopefully I've made up a bit of time for you, Kate. Thank you. That's me.
That's amazing. Thanks, Ninesh. You really have brought the time back. Thank you so much. Please keep the questions coming because we will get through them either through the recording or we'll answer them afterwards as well. But thank you so much to all the speakers for your presentations. Ninesh, I'm going to start with you, really, seeing that you had the least time, so I might as well come back to you. What would you say is like one of the biggest challenges of the approach that you've talked about here, and you know, what are the kind of mitigating factors that providers should think about?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I mean, I think I mentioned quite a few challenges and barriers, but one I didn't mention were potential legal challenges to this. So I'm not a legal expert in this area, but I suspect that there may be some fear from authorities that there could be challenges around homeless applicants being denied equity in the process. I think, you know, overall, we can ensure that the same number of homeless applicants or private sector or, you know, the chain terminating applicants can get the same number of lettings that they would have in a non-chain environment, even more perhaps. However, the proportion will change. So because the churn has increased, you know, the proportion of tenants moving and getting properties would actually increase. So that could, you know, would show up in the figures, and therefore, you know, I just wonder what the sort of legal challenge potentially would be to that. You know, that's one potential challenge.
Thank you, thank you. Leo, I'm going to come to you. There was a question very early on because you did mention defrag, and we were asked what is defrag?
Maybe I should punt that over to Ninesh. The software. It's just putting. It's a sort of metaphor from software and computers, I guess. It's just putting the right numbers of people in the right size of home. That's what I mean by that. Kind of using that as a metaphor. Maybe I won't use that term again. Sorry.
It gave me nightmares going back to the times when I used to have to defrag my computer. I was like, oh,
You like that, yeah.
Great, thank you. There was another question early on, which is for all the panelists. So, lovely Joe, hi Joe, asking what's the panel's views on the renter reform proposals and the loss of the ability for fixed-term tenancies, which could be a positive tool for right sizing. Is there anyone that wants to? I know Leo, I think you've written a response to you for the recording. If anyone wants to give a response to that.
I can jump in, just sort of restate what I wrote really, which is I mean the renters reform bill is for private renting rather than the social housing sector, and I think it's sort of still too little and like grossly too late. But measures like removing Section 21 no fault evictions, which is a major driver of homelessness in Southwark, would be hugely helpful. And I think if you've got more security and ideally affordability, which doesn't really address affordability particularly, but if you do have more security at least, then you will see a lot of the kind of demand factors hopefully calm down a little bit. So on that front, it's very useful. In terms of kind of secure tenancies, you know, ASTs, fixed term tenancies in general, in social housing, I mean, part of the point of social housing is you do provide that security, and that's a sound foundation for people to thrive in life. But yes, of course, certainly when you're trying to have those difficult conversations, as Will has sort of outlined in great detail, with older people who have secure tenancies and lots of spare bedrooms, that secure tenancy might seem like a hindrance. So, like, and it may well be that there are solutions to be had that sort of sit in between, whether there are review mechanisms if you've got 2 or more bedrooms put in place, but you never want to be compelling people to leave their home or penalising them in the way of the bedroom tax a few years ago. I think a kind of carrot rather than sticks approach is always sort of my preference.
Okay, thank you. Will, I'm gonna, if you want to answer that one, you can. The other question I have really is, have we got any of the like an update from Isle of Wight in terms of what they've actually implemented since the research was carried out?
Yeah, we have actually. So they highlighted that although the right sizing officer was something they saw as a real benefit, unfortunately, just due to constrained finances, they weren't able to take on a full-time officer. But they have updated us that they're working on a joint protocol with joint protocol group with the providers on the island to take the other recommendations forward. I think we saw that as a really big success in terms of just having joined up working within the local authority area to address those occupancy issues. And I think there definitely can be learnings taken from that, in that, in order to address these, wider issues, collaborative working between authorities and providers, not just regionally, nationally, is going to be needed to take this forward.
Thank you. And just one last question before we head off, and we will, like I say, answer any others that come through. Leo, I think this was in relation to your presentation. George says, was there an increase in demand for mobility units for under-occupiers in the study? And also, do overcrowding figures relate to the asylum seekers initiative recently brought in from the government?
I'm not sure I can answer the first one, because obviously it sort of varies from place to place. I'm not quite sure if George has to give a bit more detail where he means. That'd be handy. But the overcrowding figures, the ones I use are just from the census, so that's at that point in time in 2021. So it's for permanent residents in Britain. So no, actually, is the answer. So since those figures came out, I imagine those numbers will have gone up quite a bit. Asylum seekers being one of a number of categories that would have contributed to that.
Thank you. We are out of time. Apologies if I did get a chance to answer everyone's questions. As far as I'm aware, as long as the speakers are agreeable to it, we will share the slides. And also there will be a recording available of this session as well. It just leaves me to say thank you so much to Will, Leo and Ninesh for spending the time to talk to you guys today, and thank you everyone that's attended. I hope this has been really useful, and by all means get in touch with us if there's any other questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.